Los Angeles, Sam Donaldson.
Good evening. This is a city that in some sections is literally in flames tonight. The burning and looting that began yesterday in the wake of the not guilty verdicts and the trial of 4 policemen accused of beating motorist Rodney King unlawfully is continuing today. Those are live pictures that you're looking at now. Over 1,000 fires have been reported in the last 2 days. The acceleration of the number of fires is picking up this evening. Looting is widespread. And here are the statistics of this violence that's gone on for this length of time. There are 14 deaths that are now confirmed, more suspected. There are 450 injured at least. There are more than 300 people who have been arrested. And it's not over yet. This evening it's picking up. Let's go now to ABC's Tom Foreman, who's down in one of the trouble spots, which is down near the Harbor Freeway, USC, in the central part of the city. Tom, are you there?
I'm here. I'm right behind a Sears store where just a matter of seconds ago, about a half block away, we heard what sounded like a shot where police were trying to break up a crowd of looters. They've been pouring out literally by the hundreds from the back of the Sears store with televisions, whole racks of clothing. One man went by with a refrigerator moments ago. Police helicopters circling overhead, and within 100 feet of us are 3 of those major fires you talked about, Sam.
Well, Tom, these looters, what is their attitude? They seem to be angry. What kind of attitude are they displaying?
They have been entirely cavalier about it in the sense that they do not seem to have any fear whatsoever of the police. It is measured by the sheer volume of merchandise which they are carrying, and the fact that often even when police approach them, they will continue walking with the merchandise, and unless the police go and make them put it down, they will simply walk away looking the police officer right in the eye. A bottle was just thrown at an officer here a moment ago by one of the looters.
Well, thanks very much, Tom Foreman. The police, of course, are mobilized. The sheriff's office has mobilized all of their resources. Some 2,000 National Guardsmen were called up earlier today, and 2,000 more are about to take the streets or have taken the streets in the last 2 or 3 hours here in Los Angeles by order of the governor. Brian Rooney, ABC's Brian Rooney is out there, I think in Beverly Hills. Brian, is that where you are?
Not quite in Beverly Hills, Sam. I think I am about 2 blocks east of the border of Beverly Hills, but already there are Beverly Hills Fire Department and police officers responding to some incidents. We came about a half an hour ago to a fire that was burning uncontrolled, and people in the neighborhood were trying to put it out. They are evacuating from their apartments, and just a few minutes ago, the fire department arrived, and they're trying to knock it down. But even as we look at this, there are several other what appear to be uncontrolled fires just burning to the east of us, Sam. I've seen 15 fires as I've traveled westward through the city. La Cienega Boulevard, for those people who know Los Angeles at all, seems to be the western edge of the troubles, but it is creeping northward toward the Hollywood Hills, I would say, to within a mile and a half of the Hollywood Hills, Sam.
Well, Brian, is it clear to you that the fire department is simply overwhelmed? They don't have the units to respond to all of these fires.
Fire department's overwhelmed, so are the police. We stood with police officers several hundred feet from a store that was being looted, and the police officer said there's just not enough of them to engage with it and do anything about it.
Thanks so very much, Brian Rooney. Let's go to Sylvia Chase now of PrimeTime Live, who is at the police command headquarters in downtown. Sylvia, what's the story there?
The story is that the deputy fire chief of Los Angeles says his plan for tonight is to survive. To give you some idea of the scope, they have 20 fires burning right now between here and downtown Los Angeles. 8 of those are what are called greater alarm fires, which the deputy chief says would constitute an emergency on a normal day, a real emergency. The police are going out with all of the fire units tonight, but the whole thing is a big question, what kind of a night it will be.
Indeed. Thanks very much, Sylvia Chase. So far, the night is not a very good one. More fires are being set. There's a dusk to dawn curfew that's being put into effect tonight in an effort to try to see if the violence and the fires and the looting can be contained. Well, all this came after the acquittals in the Rodney King case, and many people, not only here in Los Angeles, but across the country, were shocked by the verdict. How, when the videotape of the beating was so clear, could the jury have come up with its not guilty verdicts? Well, it turns out that videotape evidence has often failed to convince juries when it's the police who are on trial.
If a picture speaks 1,000 words, this videotape seemed to speak volumes. At the time, it seems to be almost incontrovertible proof that excessive force was used to subdue Rodney King.
I thought the whole thing was just out of control.
Later, one of the policemen who was there even testified that he too thought other officers used excessive force the night this videotape was taken.
I'm saying there was too much force used. I said it from the beginning and I say it now.
But to the jury, the videotape carried a much different message.
It was impossible for just viewing a film that in itself was very fast, very unclear as to what blows landed where. I mean, there wasn't enough evidence given to show assault.
Jonathan Turley is an expert on police brutality cases. He says the outcome of this case was the rule, not the exception.
That even with the presence of a tape, you're talking about God's gift to a defense attorney. A police officer in a uniform is as good as you can get absent Mother Teresa as a client. And it is very difficult to convict.
Turley says what looks obvious on television can be turned around in the courtroom by skillful defense lawyers, and that videotaped evidence can lull prosecutors into a false sense of security.
Even with the presence of a tape, if that jury member is thinking what I would have done in this case, you're well on your way to an acquittal.
Usually, video or photographic evidence is a powerful courtroom tool. In 1976, prosecutors used these shots of Patty Hearst to persuade a jury she was no longer a kidnapping victim, but a dangerous terrorist. She was sentenced to 7 years. Now, home video is becoming a major factor in all kinds of criminal cases.
This is him right here.
Skip Bailey, who lives in a drug-infested neighborhood in Dallas, started making videotapes of drug deals from his house to give police the ammunition they needed to get convictions. The results? More than 200 arrests. Criminals have even convicted themselves by recording their exploits on videotape. This gang in Washington, D.C. used a stolen video camera to make home movies of a mugging rampage.
Out of one punch, knocked the man out.
The video was used to convict them at trial. But experts say that when the cameras catch police misconduct, the results can be vastly different. It goes back more than 20 years. For example, at the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968.
In the Chicago Convention cases, you had bystanders surrounding this. I mean, cops were conducting egregious conduct in front of newspaper reporters, in front of other bystanders, and juries still didn't find them guilty.
A few years ago, in New York City's Tompkins Square Park, amateur video appeared to record a clear instance of police abuse.
In the Tompkins Square Park situation, where we had hours of videotape, the sad ending of that tragedy is that not a single police officer was convicted in a criminal court.
And in Long Beach, California, a news crew recorded this police officer shoving black activist Don Jackson through a plate glass window. The charges were dismissed after the jury deadlocked.
Even though the video is showing the cop taking the law into his own hands, the jury is on another level. And their level is, I want you to protect us, we'll defend and protect you. And so they vote for a not guilty verdict.
Expert Jonathan Turley showed us how it was done in the Rodney King trial.
Now remember, the prosecution used this as their linchpin. If this film was destroyed by the defense, they had no case whatsoever. And the first attack was at the beginning of the tape.
Turley said the prosecution scored its first points by persuading the jury from the beginning they weren't seeing everything.
The door is already open, the two other individuals are missing, and the defense position was that this whole episode began and was instigated by Mr. King, and that is not on the tape.
Turley says the defense also made a smart decision to argue their case not with the video itself, but with frozen images taken from the videotape.
Now again, the defense hammered away at this. The blows only occurred when King rose up again. Now stop right there. Now once again, we have King rising. Now you see what the defense has to do here. If you focus the jury's attention on those frames alone, they seem to strongly support the defense argument. Now, as I froze in the frames here, as I focused the jury's attention on this, you begin to ask yourself, well, why is he moving like that? Why doesn't he just lay down? Why is he moving away from the officers so that they can't control him? But when you freeze on a frame and the jury accepts your overriding theory of the case, this film becomes a defense item rather than a prosecution item.
Turley says there was one more factor that weighed heavily for the defense when it came to the videotaped evidence.
The public didn't sit with the jury and watch this videotape dozens of times during the trial. Each time frames were frozen, diagrams were built off the frames. They probably saw this 100 times before they reached their decision. That has a desensitizing effect.
Turning around that key videotape evidence, making it lose its impact, was exactly what the defense focused on during the trial.
One of the things about this tape that you will realize as the case goes forward is that there's a lot of things that you don't see at first when you look at the tape. And there's a lot of things that you see only after examination.
And the defense also argued successfully that what the jury saw through the eye of the camera was not what the officers witnessed on the scene.
Statement, I described the video as something of an illusion. I told you that it was, in spite of its stark, apparent reality, it was deceptive. And I pointed out that it was taken from 175 feet away, not right up close.
In fact, a recent study showed that policemen are almost never penalized for brutality cases. In 100 recent incidents, only 5 officers were fired. Another 19 were promoted, despite $92 million in court-ordered compensation to victims.
And if it is hard enough to get convictions in these kind of cases, many here in a city now in flames feel that the way the trial was conducted stacked the deck against Rodney King. For instance, the trial was moved from downtown Los Angeles to Simi Valley, a mostly white conservative suburb.
L.A. District Attorney Ira Reiner makes no apologies.
We may have resisted that, but those are the cards that we were dealt. And we have an obligation to try the case in that county before that jury and accept their judgment.
After they picked a new trial site, they impaneled a jury of 1 Asian American, 1 Hispanic, and 10 whites. No blacks.
We profoundly disagree with it, but we also accept it because that's what the system is.
But for many here, this case personifies a system they see as corrupt and unjust.
This is live. We don't see this very often. Okay, this is unprecedented.
And today, after new threats of violence, the DA's office itself was evacuated.
Oh, look at that. Terrible. And there's no police presence down here.
Ironically, the violence that erupted in the Rodney King case has only led to more grisly cases of violence, now documented on videotape. A 25-year-old truck driver is now in critical condition after he was pummeled by angry crowds shortly after the King verdict was announced. As for King himself, he still has made no comment. But his lawyer, Steve Lerman, did tonight.
I was absolutely shocked and horrified, and I still am.
Why do you think it came down that way?
I would say there was enough of a case made out in that courtroom that any sensible person would have convicted those 4 defendants.
What is your client's reaction? What's Rodney King's reaction?
He heard the verdict and he put his head in his hands. He just said, no, 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 this can't happen. How could they do that? Why can't they see the truth?
Also tonight, the mayor of Atlanta has called for a curfew in that city, and the governor of Georgia has placed the National Guard on alert because of arson and incidents occurring in Atlanta. We'll have more live pictures of what's occurring here in Los Angeles later in our broadcast, and we'll be back in just a moment.
Still ahead, startling new accusations about Nancy and Ronald Reagan from their own daughter. But first, a primetime investigation. How safe is American meat? Our hidden cameras take you inside some of the nation's biggest meatpacking plants to expose unsanitary conditions and sloppy inspections.
We simply want to know why you allow this kind of contamination to get out. Some of these USDA, these guys need to leave.
When Primetime continues. Primetime, brought to you by Ford and your Ford dealer. Ford Cars and Trucks. Have you seen what's new for '92? Have you driven a Ford lately? Primetime continues. Now from New York, Diane Sawyer.
And now we bring you the results of a 4-month undercover investigation that took Primetime into meat packing plants across the country. We know what you're thinking right now, but we want to assure you of something right away. You don't have to close your eyes during this story. We're going to bring you information and not a lot of gore. Americans love meat. We consume nearly a quarter of all the beef produced in the world, from summer barbecues to Big Macs. We heard, however, that in the race to keep up with all that consumption, some of the meat was going uninspected at the plants. So John Quinones took PrimeTime's hidden cameras to find out what is getting past the inspectors and onto your table.
From the dusty plains of Texas to the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, every day 100,000 head of cattle are rounded up and brought to the slaughterhouse to feed America's insatiable appetite for red meat. This year alone, each one of us will eat an average of 67 pounds of beef. The meat industry calls it real food for real people. But a PrimeTime investigation has discovered that beef may pose a real danger to consumers. We went undercover inside the nation's largest slaughterhouses in Texas, Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska. Behind these doors, we found entire sides of beef covered with dirt.
Been picked up off the floor.
Hairballs mixed in with cuts of meat. And we found this, shotgun pellets buried inside a carcass, all ready for sale to unsuspecting consumers.
You're telling me that contaminated meat is getting out to the consumer and the USDA cannot do anything about it?
Our hands are tied. There's not much we can do about it.
Steve Cockerham has been a meat inspector with the U.S. Department of Agriculture for 14 years. Now he's blowing the whistle on his government employer because, he says, the health of the nation is at risk.
I predict that you will see more cases of food poisoning, people dying, people getting sick from eating contaminated meat.
I'm furious, absolutely livid that this can be allowed to go on and on.
On July 4th, 1987, in Salt Lake City, Sue and Jim Nicodemus's handicapped son, Kip, lapsed into a coma that lasted 5 weeks.
He had been sick for about a week leading up to that day. His kidneys were starting to shut down, and we couldn't imagine what was wrong.
What was wrong had nothing to do with Kip's birth defect and everything to do with the hamburger he ate just days before he went comatose. Investigators say it was the same batch of beef that killed 4 children and sent 50 other Utah residents to the hospital. It was no isolated incident. Experts say every year millions of Americans may come down with food poisoning caused by contaminated beef. The problems with inspections began in the mid-1980s when the USDA decided to give the beef industry a break with a program called the Streamlined Inspection System, SIS.
The idea is to produce more meat with less government interference. As part of this program, USDA inspectors are basically stepping aside and allowing meat plants to police themselves, to be responsible for their own cleanliness. Well, it may have sounded like a good idea when it all began, but today, sources tell PrimeTime SIS is little more than a recipe for dirty meat.
With this program, there's more contamination than ever before.
These men are licensed USDA inspectors, among the dozens of sources we interviewed during our 4-month probe.
We took an oath when we took this job to protect the consumer, and we don't feel that the consumer is being protected properly.
We investigated every single plant producing meat under SIS, the National Beef Company in Kansas, Monfort in Nebraska and Colorado, and Excel in Texas. Together, these companies produce nearly 20% of our nation's beef. Since none of these slaughterhouses would allow us inside, we applied for jobs and were hired as meat packers. The pictures you're about to see were recorded at 5 different plants with a hidden camera. Our workday starts early. After all, this plant alone will slaughter 5,000 cattle today. By the time the cattle arrive, most are muddied with their own waste. Once inside the plants, our first stop is the floor where the cows are killed. Immediately, we begin to see problems with the government's new inspection system. Take a look at how fast these production lines are moving. Before streamlined inspections, 275 carcasses would roll by these workers every hour. Under SIS, with the companies checking themselves, plants like this one in Colorado process up to 400 cattle an hour. That's one carcass every 9 seconds. Just look at what happens to that 1,000-pound carcass on the left. It falls onto a floor covered with animal waste and blood. Workers are supposed to trim that contamination off immediately. They do not. Instead, they drag it across the floor and then allow it to contaminate other carcasses. Our hidden camera captures the scene again and again. These split sides of beef are picked up off the floor. The dirt is not cleaned off. Instead, they're loaded onto a truck for shipment and delivery, leaving the meat contaminated, possibly for days. Although government inspectors are still expected to check some of the meat, during the week we spend working at this plant in Kansas, we never see a single USDA representative. On one particularly hectic night, however, we do see this. A worker collapses from fatigue and is then rushed to an ambulance. A reminder that this is the most dangerous profession in manufacturing.
These are everyday occurrences, things that go on every day.
We showed Steve Cockerham, the USDA inspector, our videotape, including perhaps the most graphic example of contamination. While gutting a cow, a Texas worker accidentally cuts its intestines. Animal waste spills out of the carcass and onto the production line.
If we see something like that, we should stop the line and make sure that that has been cleaned before the next carcass can come in contact with it.
That line was obviously not stopped.
No, it's kept moving.
And now watch what happens when a worker accidentally ruptures a cow's bladder. The meat is splattered with urine. Can they wash that off?
Contamination is supposed to be trimmed. The trouble with urine is it's hard to see.
The contaminated meat is not trimmed. It stays right on the carcass. The production line keeps moving. The contamination is even worse in the area where miscellaneous and cheaper parts of the cow are prepared.
That'll be processed into a beef byproduct, which will be added to lunch meat or ground beef or things like that.
Government inspectors used to have the authority to condemn this kind of contamination. But under self-inspection, it's up to company-paid quality control monitors like this woman. She asked not to be identified, and we changed her voice.
When it says ground beef, you don't know where it's coming from. Anything can be in ground beef.
She told us she's frequently asked to approve meat that's contaminated with hair and fragments of teeth, beef that should be rejected. Meat companies, she says, are not capable of policing themselves.
It's like putting the wolf in the chicken house to guard the chickens.
How easy is it to find contamination in beef? Well, PrimeTime obtained 10 meat samples from slaughterhouses in Texas and Nebraska. We had them analyzed at this USDA-approved laboratory. 7 of the 10 samples tested positive for fecal contamination or bacteria. In the most severe cases, scientists say bacterial contamination can cause anything from blood infections to kidney failure to spontaneous abortions in pregnant women. Dr. Glenn Morris, an expert on food poisoning, says under today's inspections, consumers have little protection against this kind of contamination.
They might find out 2 weeks later that a particular batch of beef was contaminated with salmonella. But by that time, that beef is shipped, gone, off to the consumers in supermarkets.
But contamination is not always buried in microscopic bacteria. Remember the shotgun pellets? They were found in a piece of round steak that had been inspected and approved by company monitors.
This is something that we used to watch for that we can't watch for now under the new program.
We tried to interview a number of plant officials, but the National Beef Company never returned our calls. Montford refused to show us their slaughterhouse. So we went to the Excel plant in Friona, Texas, and caught up with plant manager Terry Wilkerson.
Mr. Wilkerson, hi. I'm John Quinones from PrimeTime Live. We have some videotape taken inside your plant that we'd like to show you. We have pictures of cow feces, urine spilled into carcasses, meat that is not cut off or trimmed off but sent out for shipment.
I understand that, and I appreciate what you've done, but I can't, I've been instructed what I'm supposed to do too.
We simply want to know why you allow this kind of contamination to get out. Some of these USDA...
These guys need to leave.
Okay.
Okay.
Y'all have to leave, guys.
What?
You have to leave. You have to leave.
We're confident, John, that we have the safest food supply in the world. We're confident that we're doing a good job.
Dr. Russell Cross is the man in charge of all meat safety and inspection for the U.S. government. We showed him our videotape taken inside the plants.
This is one of the carcasses going through, and that's feces that's being washed off. Another carcass comes along, as you can see, and this is what your inspectors call cross-contamination, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
We found fecal matter in 3 of our samples. You're telling me the meat is safe? Would you feed it to your family?
I won't sit here and tell you that fecal matter in meat is safe, no.
How much fecal matter is allowable on our meat?
I'm not really sure we have a...
How much hair?
Don't have the answer to that.
How much fragments of teeth?
Don't know. I'd have to ask my experts.
We then showed Dr. Cross the most obvious example of contamination, the shotgun pellets.
How can you let this go past the inspectors?
That shouldn't have gone past an inspector, and I would have assumed that our inspector would have found that.
Here's something an inspector did find. 53 tons of beef contaminated with plastic shavings from a cutting board. The inspector rejected the meat, but the company went over his head to USDA headquarters in Washington. The agency approved the meat for distribution, complete with plastic shavings. It's all part of what these inspectors say is a dangerously cozy relationship between the USDA and the beef industry. For example, the agency is supposed to conduct unannounced inspections at every plant.
They know when there are people coming into that plant. They brought in extra people to clean up, to maintain an appearance that everything was under control.
PrimeTime obtained this in-house memo from one meat company, the Excel plant in Texas. The company alerts its staff to a USDA visit 5 days before the inspectors arrive.
Do you conduct surprise visits to these plants?
Oh, yes. We have regular visits to all of our plants.
Do these people know in advance that you're coming?
No.
This is an Excel memo that says, schedule good cattle, clean the carcasses. These people know you're going to be there.
No comment.
How can you conduct surprise visits when these people know you're coming?
I had no knowledge of that at all, John.
Fact is, even when the USDA does have knowledge of contamination, it doesn't always issue a recall or even a public warning. Remember the bacteria-tainted beef that killed 4 children in Utah? PrimeTime obtained the minutes from a USDA meeting in which officials decided not to say anything about that contamination because they were worried about bad publicity.
Your office did not recall the product because they were worried about publicity?
I'm not really aware of that condition at all. I really can't respond.
That's what the minutes say.
Yeah.
As it turned out, after Kip Nicodemus was poisoned, the USDA distributed the bacteria-tainted meat to hundreds of consumers.
If someone that was the head of a meat packing company had one of their children go through this, I think they'd look at it a little differently because they're not dealing with just a profit, they're dealing with lives.
As for the USDA inspectors, many of them tell us they no longer eat meat inspected under the new government program.
We don't want people to eat what we wouldn't eat.
You wouldn't eat the product that you're producing?
No, I would not.
Yourself?
No. No, sir.
Some notes now about all of this. The government recently announced that it will review the streamlined inspection system, which covers 20% of our beef, to make sure it's safe. What can you do to protect yourself from contamination? Experts say never eat raw or undercooked meat. Avoid contaminating other foods with juices from raw meat. Carefully check the expiration dates on meat packages. And finally, when you're cooking meat, use a meat thermometer to make sure the internal temperature of the meat is 165 degrees.
Patty Davis, the 39-year-old daughter of former President and Mrs. Reagan, has long been estranged from her parents. The fact that she had an unhappy childhood and blames her parents for much of the problem is not news. But now in a new book, an autobiography, Patty Davis has come forward with details that may shock people. Details about the way she was treated by her mother and her father, and details about herself. We talked to her about it all, and here is her story.
The truth is the truth. What happened, happened. Yes, there was abuse in this family. There was physical abuse, there was emotional abuse, there was substance abuse. That's what went down.
Patty Davis, the Reagan family rebel, says it's time to tell the truth. In revealing things of a private and embarrassing nature about her parents and herself, she argues that notwithstanding who she is and who they are, she's doing nothing more than anyone else who tries to come to terms with a painful past.
I've gotten letters from people where they tell me their family situations.
But their family situations are not the situation of a president of the United States.
Do you know something? We have to get off that in this country and in this culture. We have to get off that because there's a first family or because there's a royal family that they're any different than any other family.
But of course the Reagans are different. He was president, she the first lady. And though they've left the White House, what their daughter Patty says now about the way they treated her as a child will still shock a lot of people.
There was hitting. There was emotional tyranny in a way. I think the most prominent memory I have of my childhood is that I didn't measure up. I could never get it right.
Patty says her mother, Nancy Reagan, hit her regularly.
Every day for a while. As I got older, every day.
What would provoke her to strike you?
Oh, anything. Just me, anything.
I mean, what did she hit you with her hand?
Her hand on my face.
She'd slap you. Patty, I've got to tell you, I mean, I think most of us at one time or another felt our parents sting in some sense. A hand, a belt, a paddle.
I think most of us did. And I think most of us have a problem about that.
Patty claims her mother hit her from the time she was in grade school until she was in college because Nancy Reagan herself had had such an unhappy childhood, begging for the approval of her stepfather, brain surgeon Loyal Davis.
He held out to her this possibility of legally adopting her and giving her his last name for 10 years. This little girl stood in the operating room while my grandfather was operating on people's brains. And she fought back the nausea and she fought back the dizziness, all those things that happen when you're exposed to that kind of sight, because she wanted him to love her.
And it took 10 years before he agreed to let her be Nancy Davis.
Yeah. Can you imagine the anger that builds up in somebody to have to earn love like that?
Patty says she eventually sought out her father when he was governor of California to tell him about her mother's brutal behavior toward her.
Well, he said I was lying, and he said I was crazy, and I think it was the first time I really realized I was never, ever going to know what it would feel like to have a father. Both of my parents have an investment in denial. Basically, they each have their vision of how they want things to be. My father's is everything's fine. There's nothing wrong here. Don't tell me anything's wrong, because he's the child of an alcoholic, and his world was too difficult when he was a child, so he learned to block that out. So that's the way he does it. My mother's is the opposite, but yet the same. Hers is everything's not fine. Nothing is fine, and I'm gonna build a wall around me. I'm gonna stay behind this wall. I'm gonna put gun turrets on it. Don't you dare come close, because I know if you come close, you're going to hurt me. And so I'm gonna aim at you before you aim at me.
Is that your mother? I mean, is she a control monster?
She is someone who has a tremendous fear that things will go out of control.
It was at this point that Patty Davis lost control herself in recalling her unhappy childhood. Patty grew up in the Pacific Palisades section of Los Angeles. She says it was a sort of sealed-off kind of life, in which her parents mainly stayed home in the evenings watching television in their bathrobes. And in her mother's case, popping pills to keep going. Patty says her mother developed a drug addiction she believes persists to this day. What kind of drugs did she take?
Tranquilizers.
She was hooked?
I would say so.
How many tranquilizers would she take?
Pretty consistently through the day, I would say.
Patty believes this addiction to tranquilizers was responsible for some of her mother's well-known falls, like this one when she fell down at the 1980 Republican Convention, or in the White House East Room when she and her chair fell off the riser. Patty says her mother's habit is what got her started on drugs as a teenager. She says on the night her father was elected president in 1980, she smoked marijuana and showed up at his victory celebration stoned.
But you live life in the very fast lane.
It was sex, drugs, and rock and roll, absolutely. I knew it would horrify my parents. I was trying to horrify my parents.
Why? You wanted to hurt them.
Oh, I think so. Sure, there was a lot of anger there. Absolutely.
I wish you peace.
Part of Patty's rebellion involved living with guitarist Bernie Leadon of the popular rock group The Eagles. Her parents didn't approve. And it was during this period that Patty decided to take a step that she thought would permanently prevent her from ever having children of her own.
Now, the story that's out there is that you can't have children because you had a number of abortions.
I have never had an abortion. In fact, I've never been pregnant in my life. I got sterilized when I was 24. I had a tubal ligation. I was very afraid that if I became a mother, I would do to my child some of the things that my mother did to me.
10 years later, Patty had the operation reversed.
It's up to each of us to increase people's awareness of the...
Another way Patty struck back at her parents was to publicly oppose her father's policies.
That attitude did not endear Patty to her mother and father. But the real break with the first family accelerated over one incident.
The book is called Home Front. And
Patty wrote a novel published in 1986 called Home Front, which took dead aim at her parents.
You like it?
I thought it was interesting fiction.
A fictional format, maybe, but everybody recognized that the main characters, a right-wing California governor named Canfield, who became president, and his society-oriented wife, who was an awful mother, were meant to be the Reagans, who reacted at the time to Barbara Walters this way.
I didn't recognize anyone in that, and certainly the happenings never happened.
What kind of a mother do you think you were, Mrs. Reagan?
I tried to be a good mother. I don't think anybody's perfect. But then, you know, there's no perfect parent, there's no perfect child.
She was a good mother.
If the truth as Patty sees it is in her new book, she does, surprisingly perhaps, have some kind things to say about her parents. When Ronald Reagan was shot in 1981, Patty says she and her mother reached out to each other.
And I went into her room, and I didn't see the mother who had hit me. I didn't see the mother who I had been so frightened of for so long. I saw a woman who had almost lost her husband and who had not known whether or not he would live. And
she slept with his shirt.
She told me that she came back from the hospital that night and she took one of his shirts and she slept with it. And I remember that moment, sitting on the bed with her and hearing her tell me that. And it was the first time that I felt what forgiving her would feel like.
And Patty defends her mother against the story that her mother had had an affair with Frank Sinatra.
I don't believe that. You know, they are friends. They've been friends for many years, but I don't believe anything went on between them. My parents are so in love with each other. It is inconceivable to me that really that either one of them could be with anybody else.
How long have you lived here, Patty?
About 4 years.
Patty Davis lives alone these days in a modest house in Santa Monica, estranged from her family. The last time